With patch 4.4 coming close to release, I wanted to give my concluding thoughts on the state of the upcoming characters and my analysis on their meta strength. Specifically, Xianyun. Gaming has been chilling, receiving very few changes, so there's not too much to say other than he's looking like a solid 4-star DPS with great potential at C6. With Xianyun, there has been a lot of back and forth discussion about her usefulness and strength, which makes sense as she's the anticipated 5-star of the patch, and has gotten a lot of changes these past weeks. I already made 3 other videos on Xianyun covering what she does, team comps, builds, etc., while also analyzing her abilities as she was changed over the weeks. If you're interested in that information, feel free to check those videos out first, as this one will kind of build on what I talked about in the previous videos. Personally, I have a more positive evaluation on her kit, but I understand that it is actually somewhat controversial. So to give some context on my perspective on Xianyun, I wanted to address her issues and some of the most popular criticisms that people have about her role and her kit. The first thing I want to address is the idea that what she does, her plunge buff and healing, isn't strong in the first place. In regards to her A4 plunge buff, remember that it adds flat damage, working similar to Shenhe Quill's and Yunjin normal tech buffs. This means that the damage it actually provides is much higher because it is multiplied by crit and damage percent. And also, you don't have to max the buff out for it to be strong. In order to cap the buff, you'll need 4.5k attack based on the current scaling, which is practically impossible. And that's why all calculations assume around 3000 attack on Xianyun. And even with 3000 attack, early calcs show her buff to be quite strong. I brought up the summary of calculations made by Jstern25 in a previous video, and I'm going to bring them up again to emphasize the idea that Xianyun brings a lot of damage to a team that can utilize plunges. Yes, calcs are not entirely indicative to in-game experience, but it gives us a general idea on her power level. Again, huge credit to Jstern, and I highly recommend checking him out. At 3.3k attack, Xianyun can add around 50,000 damage per plunge, and squeezing in 6 plunges per rotation, she can add around 300,000 damage per rotation. Bringing her attack value to a more reasonable 3,000, I estimate she can still bring about 250,000 damage per rotation, which is really good considering Jean, her direct competitor, has no area in her kit that adds this amount of damage to a team. Even his Hu Tao team DPS calcs visualizes this idea, showing a promising around 80,000 team DPS. There have been concerns that Farina Yalan with Xianyun is not enough for Hu Tao to plunge all charge attacks and plunges, which makes people wary about the strength of the team. And while this is true, it doesn't really matter when the overall damage is still high as shown, potentially better than the Jean version because of Xianyun's A4 buff and the fact that even though you can't vape everything from Hu Tao, in return you can still vape with Yalan and Farina, which is still good. Now, a common argument is that Jean can indeed bring more damage because of her higher instant heal, which can generate more fanfare stacks more quickly when you run a Farina team, and thus gives more damage percent to the team. I discussed this point in more depth in my Thoughts in Theory Crafting 3 video, and the summary of my view is that in most rotations, your team HP will be high enough where Xianyun's heal is enough to full heal the team, and you won't actually take advantage of Jean's front loading a fanfare with a higher instant heal anyways. Both heal just perfectly fine, but I think Jean's supposed strength of front loaded fanfare is overrated by many since it's not always utilized in practice. Going back to her A4 plunge, while I've shown that it can bring a lot of damage to a team utilizing plunges, it can only work on a single enemy per plunge. This single target buff is cited as a flaw to many. For instance, comparing Xianyun and Bennett with Xiao, it conceptually makes sense that Xianyun would be better for buffing Xiao in single target, while Bennett would be better in buffing Xiao if he's plunging multiple enemies. While I don't have exact calcs to support this, I do 100% agree with this idea. But I don't really view Xianyun's single target buff as that much of a downside because of the nature of Spiral Abyss Floor 12. I've been doing and clearing Floor 12 since forever, and I can tell you that for the majority of the time, the Abyss is single target oriented. Just referencing this current Abyss patch 4.3 floor 12, we can see that most of the enemies here are actually just single target bosses. For example, chamber 1, 2 bosses. Chamber 2, we can see a 1 enemy, and then 2 enemies. Now, when there are like 2 enemies, I don't actually think that single target oriented damage or buffs, such as from Xianyun, are that much of a disadvantage. Just with 2 enemies, you can pretty simply kill one faster than the other and then just move on to the next one. So with 2 enemies, I don't really see that much value of, oh, Bennett's buff is stronger because you can hit 2 enemies at once and your damage is buffed for both enemies. And then for the second half, now yes, 5 enemies on the first wave, but 2 enemies on the other 2 waves. So yes, Bennett buff in the case of Xiao is better than Xianyun. However, you'll see that most of the cases where you're able to AoE mobs down, most of the mobs there are actually just relatively weak, in my opinion. Like Geoslimes and Geospecters, you don't really see them as mobs that are really bulky. And again, Chamber 3, Hydrotopa, 2 mobs, and then 2 mobs here. Now, Eremites, they can spawn another 2 mobs, so technically there are 4 mobs, but again, like I said about the Geospecters and the Geoslime, usually when you can AoE content down, I don't really think that the enemies are that bulky, and this includes the Eremites. Most abysses are kind of designed around a single chamber that is typically the hardest one, and we kind of want to build around it, and in this case it is the Hydrotopa. Going back to the 4.2 abyss, you can see here, yes, there are more enemies, so maybe AoE is better here. Personally, I don't think there are enough enemies where Xianyun would be that much of a detriment. Second half, again, another boss. Here, again, we do have a couple more enemies, but again, like I said, most of these mobs are relatively weak when compared to other mobs that you can face. And again, second half, another boss. And for Chamber 3, Wave 1, yes, there are 4 mobs. Xianyun wouldn't be as good here. Wave 2 does only have 2 mobs though. And again, second half is another single target boss. And I would say for this abyss, the Dirge is probably one of the hardest, but you could definitely make the argument that this chamber would be the hardest. And lastly, going to the 4.1 abyss, first half, again, single target boss. Second half, there are a lot of walls, and usually when the hardest chamber of abyss isn't a single target boss, usually it's going to be either tons of wolves or tons of electors and heralds that you need elemental checks with. So again, here it would be an example where AoE would be better. Then it would be a better buffer to Xiao than Xianyun in this case, because there's tons of wolves. If we go over to the other chambers, you can see more single target oriented stuff, and again, more single target oriented stuff. So the point I'm trying to ultimately make is that even though Xianyun's A4 buff is only single target, in most cases in Spiral Abyss floor 12, which should be the standard of evaluating character strength with a meta viewpoint, in most cases it's fine because the Abyss is typically single target oriented. And even with just a single target buff, the damage buff is still really good like I showed. However, the damage buff only applies on plunge attacks, so your team needs to have a carry that can utilize plunge attacks, otherwise you cannot take advantage of Xianyun's buff. And if your team doesn't want to plunge, Xianyun becomes quite similar to Jean in a team. This has caused a lot of people to color Chu Niche to be a valuable pool, as there aren't that many plunge-oriented characters in the game. First of all, addressing Xianyun in non-plunge teams, I want to emphasize that even though you don't take advantage of her massive buff, she still perfectly fulfills her role as an animal healer just like Jean. And not everyone has Jean, whether through luck or just because they haven't played long enough. So in many Farina teams where an animal healer is the best slot for the team, Xianyun will be a valuable pull, especially for those who don't have Jean. Same thing goes with non-Farina teams. While I think most of these teams' best character combo don't include an animal healer, slotting in one is perfectly fine, and with the correct substitutions, will still make a solid team. And my mega cope take is that for these teams that quote-unquote don't plunge, it could be the case where these teams actually want to plunge in order to increase their team DPS by taking advantage of Xianyun's buff that has been buffed multiple times already. Of course, I know this is cope, but even just disregarding this, she still, remember, fulfills the role of an animal healer. And just that fact alone makes her more versatile in team building than a typical quote-unquote niche character. Now, focusing on plunge teams, I will agree that there are not that many characters being considered that 100% synergize very well with plunge attacks, so I do personally view her plunge buff as niche. However, I don't think that it is that severely limiting. Just comparing her with Shenhe at most buffs 3 units well. With Xianyun, we are already considering 5, and keep in mind that while Shenhe is locked to cryo, Xianyun isn't locked to just plunge carries. It's not like she'll only buff Xiao and Gaming, and we have to rely on Hoyo releasing another plunge DPS in the future. I think this sentiment is missing the point of what Xianyun brings to Genshin. She can enable any character to perform plunge attacks. And while a lot of characters may not necessarily benefit from spending the time to plunge because it doesn't line up with their rotation, for the characters that do, or it is an option, it brings a novel, viable playstyle. So ideally, we'll get future characters that have their own unique playstyle and also have the option to benefit off of plunging with Xianyun. That way, future characters will have more options and viable teams. However, many people may not like this plunge style of gameplay for various personal reasons and won't pull for Xianyun. And if you're one of those people, I want to say that that's perfectly fine, and I would 100% do the same in your shoes. Plunge attacks themselves have their own practical gameplay issues, such as being stuck in animation, making the gameplay feel less smooth, and most importantly, knocking back enemies with each plunge attack. If you've ever played Xiao, you'll know what I'm talking about. The struggle of having to jump to chase those Geo-Vishafs that get knocked back with each plunge you do is pretty frustrating. And teams with Xianyun will probably have to deal with the same issues and is 100% one of her biggest flaws in their teams. How bad it will feel can only be really answered once we're able to play her teams in game. And I think the only best solution to this overarching problem is to make it so that when you do perform a plunge attack that is buffed with her A4, the plunge attack also creates a small vortex with grouping potential. This solves some of her gameplay issues as well as provides more benefits when utilizing Xianyun to her core strength, plunging. And it gives the CC and grouping that it seems that everyone is asking for. Speaking of CC, this is the final point of concern I wanted to address. This was a huge point of the discussion when the small CC after performing a triple E plunge was removed and replaced with a minor crit rate buff. The doom posting was definitely at the highest at this point, with many people concluding Xianyun's lack of usefulness with the CC removal. I've addressed a portion of this already in my Thoughts and Theory Crafting 2 video, but I wanted to reiterate my two main points against this reaction. First, the original CC wasn't even that helpful in the first place. With a 12-second cooldown, you are realistically only getting one instance of grouping per rotation. Sure, this can help group the enemies initially before switching to your main carry, but if you're plunging, you're inevitably going to knock them away again, so that problem still exists. And second, the grouping requires a triple E plunge. The animation time for this is way longer than the difference between a casual press and a casual hold E, to the point where extending the rotation to group is going to lower team DPS. It was more likely that you just single E plunge, and this is the current case now, especially since you now get 5 particles from it. On top of that, the actual CC and grouping that you originally got wasn't even strong in the first place. There's also this sentiment that as an Anemo character, it doesn't make sense to remove her CC or grouping capability. But just going over the current Anemo roster, there are only 3 characters that fulfill this desired role: Kazuha, Sucrose, and Venti. Personally, I think Sucrose's grouping is kind of sus, but we'll leave her in there just in this case. Everyone else can CC, but it's not grouping that most people want. But the main thing I want to say about this topic is this: a character, in this case an Anemo character specifically, doesn't need to group to be strong. Just go back to the numbers on Xianyun's A4 plunge buff I showed earlier. And just because you can group well doesn't mean you're strong. Just look at Venti. Sure, he has great CC and grouping potential, but because the Abyss enemies don't favor him anymore and he is lacking in other areas such as damage amplification compared to other characters, he rarely gets used. So while Xianyun may not have grouping and it's understandable to be disappointed that we can't use her for that utility, I think it's unfair to call her weak because she makes up for it with strong healing and plunge buffs. So those are all the concerns and issues I wanted to address about Xianyun. To conclude, I will leave you with my final verdict on her state in the current meta. I believe Xianyun is an above average 5-star unit with above average pull value. She's not a must pull in my opinion and perfectly skippable, for example if you don't have Farina or you don't want to play the plunge attack playstyle, but she's by no means a trash character and can be an extremely valuable pull. For example, if you don't have Jean, you have Farina and you need an animal healer, or you want to play with a plunge attack playstyle where you'll take advantage of Xianyun's buffs very well. She can be a versatile unit because she consolidates the role of animal and healer just like Jean, and she can boost a team's overall damage significantly in the right scenarios with her A4 plunge buff. And lastly, she enables a plunge playstyle for any character in the game, giving more gameplay and team building variety for all current and future Genshin characters. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about Xianyun. Remember that this is all from a meta perspective. If you like or dislike characters for reasons such as design and personality, feel free to pull or skip, as those reasons are ultimately more important than the meta. Personally, I'm very excited for her release and can't wait to pull both her and Gaming and try them out in Abyss. You'll definitely see me make some videos showcasing them on patch release. If you don't want to miss out on that or want to watch any future discussions I'll have with future upcoming characters, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a ton and I really enjoy analyzing Genshin like this and hopefully helping people out. So with that, I wish you all the best if you're pulling on patch 4.4 and hope all of you have a wonderful day.